So basically, what you will see when you play it is the slides. There is a way you can click on the video portion of it as well. And I'll tell you where that can come in handy. I may see if I can use this thing, but if not, if I write something on the blackboard and have that camera pick it up, you can click on the video portion of Integrity Recording and have it fill the screen and see what's on the blackboard, because I've done that in the past. But I'm going to try to see if I can use that for a moment. The fallacies, as I say, have been discussed since Aristotle. Medieval logicians, you probably heard about monasticism and the scholastic philosophers of the Middle Ages. They did a lot of work in logic. And many of the big Latin names you're going to see for these fallacies date back to the Latin names that medieval philosophers gave the fallacies. Well, while there might be only one way to construct a valid argument in a given situation, or the number of good arguments is limited, bad arguments can go bad in a virtually infinite number of ways. So you can say, well, if there are a virtually indefinite number of bad arguments and the ways they can go bad, well, why is it that we single out a subset of those bad arguments and discuss it specifically? In other words, how is it that we single these arguments out among all the possible bad arguments? Why do we focus on them when we discuss the fallacies? Well, there are several reasons. One is that these mistakes in reasoning are easily made. They occur often in writing, in speaking, in media. These are mistakes that are easy to make. One of the most famous examples, and you'll see it later in the slides, is John Stuart Mill commits a Logic 101 fallacy in his own writing on ethics, when he uses a word with two different meanings in the same argument, and so his argument doesn't work. And you say, well, why mention John Stuart Mill among all the people who wrote in ethics? Well, if this were the 19th century, and I were trying to choose a really good logic text, certainly one of the things that would be at the top of my list of possibilities would be John Stuart Mill's textbook on logic. So here's somebody who wrote a textbook on logic who still commits a Logic 101 fallacy when he writes in ethics. So sometimes, it's like the biblical story of the person who sees the mote in somebody else's eye but doesn't look at the problem in their own. It's always easier to spot this in other people than themselves. So they involve mistakes that are easily made, even by very educated people. Okay. But now here's the reason. Why are they used so long? Why do we see them so long? Because they have a certain amount of practical effectiveness. Because even though, from a technical perspective, these bad arguments, these fallacies, are not good and should not persuade people, nonetheless, they tend to look like they're good pieces of reasoning. So they are psychologically persuasive even if they're logically incorrect. And that's another reason why we find them a lot, that they work. Now, I'll tell you one place they work a lot is in advertising, and we'll see that later on. Now, sometimes someone will accuse someone of committing a fallacy and say, well, that's a non sequitur. Now, Hurley basically says, well, a non sequitur is just another name for fallacy. Well, strictly speaking, that's not exactly true, but it's not too bad to think of it that way. If somebody says, look, what you just said is non sequitur, the literal meaning of the word non sequitur, which is Latin, is it does not follow. So, in other words, a non sequitur is not a specific fallacy, but it's a word that denotes most of the fallacies where the conclusion does not follow logically from the premises for one reason or other. So if someone accuses someone else of committing a non sequitur, what they're accusing them of doing is not committing a particular fallacy. At least they shouldn't be. But I'm merely claiming that their reasoning is fallacious in the sense that their conclusion does not follow logically from the premises. In other words, in many of these fallacies, the conclusion does not even follow in a probabilistic way, but it may look like it does. So you often hear this term non sequitur used by people, and it just means the conclusion does not follow from the premises. Now, there are various ways these fallacies have been lumped together in groups, to make it easier to study them. And your text has one way of organizing them. And it's a pretty standard way. So when we talk about the fallacies, we're going to talk about them in groups. So the first group of fallacies are referred to as fallacies of relevance. Now, as I like to say, it might be more descriptive of what they really are to refer to them as fallacies of irrelevance, because what the fallacies in this group have in common is that the information given in the premises as evidence is entirely irrelevant to establishing the truth of the conclusion. In other words, even if the premises are true, the truth of the premises would be utterly irrelevant to establishing the conclusion of these fallacies as true. So that's why we call them fallacies of relevance. Now we're going to see that we have another category called fallacies of faulty induction, where there is some connection between premises and conclusion. There just isn't a very good one. But here, the premises are utterly irrelevant to whether the conclusion is true. Now, one of the things one of my grad school professors used to say when I was a teaching assistant in one of his logic classes when I was in grad school, and he would say, there's some discussion as to whether or not the argumentum ad vacuum was a serious fallacy or just a medieval joke. But there is reason to think of it as a legitimate fallacy. The argumentum ad vacuum literally means an appeal to the stick. This is the kind of argument that the Godfather makes when he, makes an offer you can't refuse. In other words, this argument cites some threat, and it might be a physical threat, the threat of physical force. It might be a psychological threat that something bad could happen to you. You could lose your job or whatever. Basically, a threat is cited as a reason to accept the argument, to accept the conclusion of the argument as true. And of course, this is a fallacy of relevance because the threat has nothing to do with whether the conclusion is true. Okay, we'll take it up here. If somebody has to get to another class, it's 10 up. But yeah, real quick, or you can ask it next time.
Okay, and but that's the second fallacy?
No. This is the first fallacy under the classification of fallacies of relevance.
Okay.
In other words, there are a lot of particular fallacies that fall under that group.
Okay, I see.
And this is the first one of those. So we'll say more on this next time. Sorry it takes so long to find everything. But this is on your, already on Blackboard.
Oh, great. Okay.
So it's there. Did I call a roll? Let me double check. Let me just stop this recording.
Okay.